Hi everybody, you're listening to Comics and History, episode number 119, Spotlight on the Spectre in the Golden Age. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session after close to 4 weeks, and I called it on episode number 118. My little girl, Victoria, has been keeping me quite busy this summer, keeping me away from my recording device, the recording studio. Combine that with some administrative work I've needed to do for school, as well as some ongoing construction in my apartment building. It's made it less than conducive on a number of days to sit down and record. But I do hope to get another recording to you folks sooner rather than later. But again, if it's not within the customary 2 weeks, don't be afraid. The show is not going anywhere. It's just that I am continuing to find myself quite occupied with different summer tasks. I need to start this episode by sending out 3 shoutouts. The first shoutout goes to Mike, Chris, and Rob over at Geek Brunch Retrocast. I'm so far behind in my podcast listening. Again, different things going on in life, and I found out just recently that the guys reached episode number 100 on their show, and so to you gentlemen, I apologize for getting this out so late, but many congratulations on reaching that milestone. For those of you folks who have not had a chance to listen to Geek Brunch Retro, you can find it on iTunes, a number of podcast catchers. Please give their show a listen. Mike, Chris, and Rob have such wonderful chemistry together. They have a real love for all things retro. It's well worth listening to. My second shout out goes to Jason, and I have an email from Jason to read. His name is Jason Jaroslawski. Jason, my apologies if I misread your last name. And Jason wrote in some time ago and said, just listened to this episode and it was very enjoyable. I love how you reference the issue numbers and years in your podcasts. Your theory on this Batman from Detective Comics number 500 to kill a legend, which DC turned into an Earth 5 character, was also very interesting. Your knowledge and fact-checking are excellent. Thanks for great podcasts, Brian. And that's from Jason. And Jason, thank you so much for writing in. It's really thrilling when I get feedback from great listeners such as yourself. And based on Jason's other feedback over at the Comics and History Facebook page, I think Jason's a relative newcomer to the show. So Jason, welcome aboard. Really appreciate the kind words you had to say over on the CNH Facebook page about my Alan Scott Spotlight series. And hopefully by the time you're listening to this, Jason, you've already read my reply to you with regards to some great suggestions for future episodes, such as Aquaman Spotlight series. I'd really like to take on that challenge because I'd like to address the question of when exactly Aquaman came to be considered a joke. And let me make it clear, folks, I do not think of Aquaman as a joke, and I think it's very unfortunate that he's become the butt of so many jokes in recent years. So shining the spotlight on Aquaman will be a great chance for me to present just how great a character Aquaman really is. I know that when it comes to look at the Bronze Age, that'll be something of an interesting challenge for me, but more on that much further down the road. Also, Jason suggested I talk about the Batman Wildcat team-ups. I'm thinking about those team-ups from the Bronze Age, from writers such as quote-unquote Crazy Bob Haney. That would allow me to record an episode about DC continuity in the Bronze Age and the rise of this Earth B, which has come to be viewed by a lot of fans and historians as an actual Earth. It was something which was first created with the intent of being a spot for a variety of stories which didn't really fit into the regular Earth 1 or Earth 2 continuities. There's been a whole lot of research done into Earth B in recent years, with people suggesting that Earth B actually needs to be split up into at least 3 separate Earths. So that would be a really great topic of discussion. Jason also suggested looking at Green Lantern Flash team-ups. That'd be really neat. I'd really like to focus on the Jay Garrick and Alan Scott team-up stories. And I know I've spoken about them in passing in my Alan Scott Spotlight series, but given that Hal Jordan and Barry Allen get so much coverage in a lot of other podcasts, I think it'd be a neat challenge for me to look at Jay Garrick and Alan Scott, 2 iterations of those franchises that aren't completely obscure, but for so many years have been forced to take a back seat due to DC editorial policy being so up and down with regards to its Golden Age characters and Golden Age legacy over the years. So thank you to Jason for inspiring a lot of different show ideas coming out in future weeks, months, and years. And with regards to being inspired by other listeners and other podcasters, I need to send out a special shout out to fellow podcaster Ed Moore, who is quite the prolific podcaster. He has a number of podcasts which he either hosts on his own or he co-hosts. He has a podcast about Thor, which he co-hosts with his wife. I loved listening to his Emerald Archer podcast, which he co-hosted with his son Nick. And I think Nick's reached a point in his life where he's busy with his schooling, and so I haven't seen any new episodes of Emerald Archer in recent times. But that was a really fun look at Green Arrow through the Golden, Silver, Bronze Ages of comics, as well as looking at current comics featuring Green Arrow. And right now, Ed has his ongoing Lords of Order podcast, which is a great look at the history of Dr. Fate. Ed always starts out by looking at a comic book from the Golden Age featuring Dr. Fate. In other words, he's looking at Dr. Fate's appearances in more fun comics, and he takes a look at the Spectre's career in chronological order. So he's also taking comics that look at Dr. Fate's Golden Age past, and he's fitting those into the general chronology of Dr. Fate, while he also looks at more recent Dr. Fate comics. Ed's a really great podcaster. He's another one of those podcasters who has a real love for the comics medium, and clearly he puts a lot of research and consideration into his work. And what I really like is the voice which he presents. He doesn't come across as someone who knows it all. There's a really nice measure of humility in Ed's voice, where you can tell that he certainly knows a lot about what he's talking about, but he's also a fellow fan. He's not putting himself above everybody else. And a couple of times over the years, Mr. Moore has mentioned that he'd really like to see somebody produce a Spectre podcast. And he's commented that there aren't any Spectre podcasts out there. And so in recent weeks, I've been doing my own looking into this. And, I've checked iTunes and there's nothing there. And certainly iTunes is no longer the only place to get podcasts. But just looking on the web in general, it doesn't seem like there is a podcast out there that is devoted to the Spectre. Now, the internet, of course, is a huge, huge place. So somewhere out there, there could be at least one or two Spectre podcasts out there. And for those of you listening at home, if any of you know of a Spectre exclusive podcast, please let me know so that I can shout them out on future Spectre Spotlight episodes. So I've been thinking about what Ed's been saying on his show, and I thought, well, I certainly don't have the time to start a second podcast devoted entirely to the Spectre, but I can at least have a Spectre Spotlight series here. And certainly the Spectre is not a completely obscure character, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that he's an A-list character either. He's certainly a very powerful character, someone who's played a notable role in various DC stories over the years, a couple of very important stories, to say the least, in the last 30 years. But he's certainly one of those Golden Age characters who deserves a lot more love. I first became aware of the Spectre, I guess sometime before Zero Hour. I saw him in different advertisements for different DC comics, but I never actually read the Spectre until I read Zero Hour, and it was really neat to see his confrontation with Hal Jordan, who at the time was considered to be Parallax. This was before the whole Parallax retcon, and then years later, it was so funny to see how that relationship between Hal and the Spectre, their Parallax too, became so much more complex. But ever since Zero Hour, I've been really interested in the Spectre. In terms of my favorite time periods involving the Spectre, certainly the Golden Age is great. I'll be talking about a few important Golden Age Spectre stories in this episode, of course, but I'm really looking forward to talking about the Spectre in the Bronze Age and taking a closer look at those really great Michael Fleischer, Jim Aparo Spectre stories from Adventure Comics that were later reprinted in the 1980s. That's just one of those timeless series. And then there's the John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake run. I'm sure that I'm going to be referencing Mr. Ostrander and Mandrake at different points in this episode here. I just can't wait to talk about them and their run in greater detail when I talk about the Spectre in the Copper Age. So let's get started, shall we? The Spectre was created by Jerry Siegel, yes, that Jerry Siegel, and Bernard Bailey. Siegel was the writer, Bailey was the artist. There are some comics historians who argue that Siegel was the sole creator of the Spectre and Bailey was there simply as the artist. I think that's really unfair. When it comes to a character's first appearance, you really have to include the artist there, unless, and this is a real stretch, unless the writer has come up with the look of the character on their own and the artist is just following the writer's instructions word for word. But given that after a point Mr. Siegel enlisted in the army and was fighting over, or at least foreign duty overseas, Bernard Bailey would become the writer-artist on the Spectre, and so I think he certainly needs to be considered a co-creator of the Spectre as well, while Mr. Siegel is very well known for being the co-creator of Superman. I fear that Bernard Bailey's name is not that familiar.